You're watching or listening to Private Members Club, and for the next 20 minutes, half an hour, we are going to be talking about the week in politics, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I am Matt.
And I'm John.
So particularly, obviously, the reason we've convened is to talk about the BBC presenter situation, so that's just over a week. Let's come back to that in a second, because one of the sort of theories that was put about especially early on, and this was battered about quite a bit, and I want to get this out of the way at the start, is that the reason the Sun broke the story then is to try and deflect attention away from the fact that Boris Johnson wasn't going to hand over his phone on the deadline on, was it Monday or Tuesday? It was Monday, wasn't it?
Monday, I think, yeah.
Monday, 4 p.m. He was supposed to hand over his phone to the investigation. And of course he never did. And of course it didn't become a news story, partly because this was dominating the news. And so people said, oh, they've broken this in order to deflect attention away from that. I've got to be honest, I don't think that ever really was a news story, because he didn't hand over his phone the last time he was supposed to. And that's when it was a news story. And when they gave him an extension, nobody was expecting him to hand over his phone at the end of the extension. And all the extenuating circumstances that he and the lawyers have put forward, can't remember the password and all this kind of stuff, all of those things were spoken about last time he was supposed to hand over his phone. So I mean, this is just a little PS of a news story. This is not a news story in its own right. So I don't know. I don't think this was broken then in order to deflect attention from this as a news story. I think there's another much bigger, more obvious reason that people have spoken about. But just before we do move on, Boris Johnson, the phone, were either of you remotely surprised that they still haven't,
They found the passcode.
They have now, have they?
Yeah.
Oh, I've missed that.
Apparently they found the passcode, so it's looking very good that they'll be able to access it.
Well,
but personally, I think anytime anybody says this newspaper has released this information in order to deflect from this news story, I think that's probably rubbish, because I don't think they necessarily think as tactically as that.
No,
I think that's kind of optimistic. I think they just release things. I mean, sometimes they'll release things when they think it will get a slight bump in viewers or readers.
Yeah. Well, in order to release it, in order to deflect attention from something else, they'd have to have been sitting on it for a certain amount of time. Yeah. And it doesn't sound like they were sitting on it for a great length of time. I mean, 7 weeks.
The other thing I do believe in, because we saw it with the expenses, the MP's expenses scandal, is that they sit on certain bits of the story in order to trickle it out day by day. So that's a possibility. So they kind of manipulated it so that it's sort of elongated.
Having said that's tactical. Yeah, there wasn't an awful lot of that in this. So, in fact, most of that came from the BBC itself, didn't it?
Yeah, so the problem with this story is I don't think there was much else to trickle out, as it turns out. And the BBC picked up the baton handily and started running with it.
Well, this is it. As I said to you both, I listen to about 3 news podcasts a day, while I'm at work. And yeah, this came up over and over again, that the BBC had basically overcompensated for, because when it was, and there is no direct allusion, but one allusion that is often made whenever a scandal of any kind comes up is, well, Jimmy Savile got away with it for years, and he was basically protected, insulated by the BBC and by other organisations, because nobody was prepared to look into it.
Do you mean like the Conservative Party?
Well,
yeah, but I think the Savile link isn't the fact that he was protected whilst he was alive. It's the fact that the BBC actively cancelled the news item on Savile for Newsnight. And then they went to ITV, and it was ITV that broke the story. And I think that's the criticism that the BBC is kind of sensitive to, because they kind of dropped the ball on it then, and they're fairly determined not to drop the ball on any sort of scandal now, and they've swung the pendulum completely the other way.
Having said that, so we'll come back to the actual accusations and the people involved and everything else in a second. But having said that, just while we're on a note of the BBC, this accusation was first put to them 7 weeks ago. Now, it turns out they get about 40 such accusations every month, or I guess 10 a week. If you're getting 10 accusations of this kind a week, the BBC have a team whose job it is. I mean, they get so many of these things. They essentially, by the sound of it, have a team whose job it is to look into these accusations. And obviously, this team, they have other jobs to do as well. They don't spend sort of 7 days a week, 24 hours a day looking into these accusations. But they get so many accusations, and 99.9% of these accusations turn out to be just sort of people being malicious for the sake of playing silly beggars because they don't like such and such a person, or they don't like such and such an aspect of the organization, or whatever. When it came to these accusations, apparently this team emailed and phoned the people who'd made the accusations, the family of the young person in question, but just one phone call, which presumably wasn't answered, and one email, which presumably wasn't answered. And because they weren't answered, they let it drop, by the sound of it. So
if you've got a policy, if you've got so many accusations, it's quite likely that you're going to be, I wouldn't say cynical, but you're going to be careful about these things. You're just not, you're going to say, if it was going to be taken further, they'd be straight back to us. And I think it was made to a regional BBC office, wasn't it, rather than a central complaint?
Or to Victoria, Derbyshire. Because I can't remember now exactly what the position is, because Victoria, Derbyshire does a programme, or used to do a programme, a daytime programme.
Yeah, I think she still does.
I think so. Where she does, and the programme is, I don't know, I don't watch daytime TV, so I've not seen it, but isn't it specifically set up to investigate matters where the public can't or haven't been able to get any success out of going to the police or other authorities? So her programme looks into things instead. I wonder if the complaint might have been made there, because obviously Derbyshire has a huge presence on.
Wouldn't it just be made to HR?
I don't, but this is it.
BBC's massive HR department take it up and start.
Well, it would be made to wherever, and then it would be thrown upstairs to HR. I think, as with a lot of these organisations, actually, if you go on the website, there are so many different addresses, so many different places you can contact and ways you can contact. It's not actually that easy necessarily, especially if you're not used to doing this kind of thing, to find where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. So sometimes you'll just make contact at your sort of first port of call. And if this family are Sun readers, having gone to the Sun, you've got to assume there's a good chance that they're Sun readers, because again, it's all about your mindset, isn't it? What's your first port of call? So you go to the BBC. It's difficult to figure out what you're supposed to do. Victoria, Derbyshire does a programme that maybe you watch. I might be getting this wrong. I know Victoria, Derbyshire is involved somehow. I don't know if it's the family who went to her, or maybe there's a suggestion that there were, further down the line, there were other members of the BBC, 2 of them, I think now, who also made complaints at some point. I wonder if maybe they went to Derbyshire instead. There's some suggestion that she's involved in some way in investigating anyway. My point being, if you're of the mindset to get in touch with the Sun, you might also be of the mindset to get in touch with a programme like a Victoria, Derbyshire programme, because in some ways they perform similar functions. They investigate things that are outside of the purview of the organisations who should be set up to investigate these things. And that's kind of how some people...
Sapphire and steel.
Not quite. So let's talk about the complaint. Because, well, I don't know if it's necessarily this, and obviously there are so many facts that were left out, and it feels to me like the Sun never had those facts, because they've never made any attempt to back any of this stuff up, to substantiate any of it. So it feels to me like potentially you could have a situation. This is, when I first heard it, this is kind of what went into my head, and this is how I was thinking about it. Kid, let's say 21, 22 years old, parent finds out that the kid's been doing cocaine, and the kid might not have a bad cocaine habit, the way it's been painted is that this kid is addicted to crack cocaine and is on like some kind of downward spiral or whatever. I suspect that's probably not the case, because sometimes when a parent finds out that the kid's taking cocaine, the parent will overreact, right? So the parent gets into a slanging match with the kid. How do you afford it? I do OnlyFans. Well, that's outrageous. No, it's respectful. Hugh Edwards pays me. And you can imagine that the shouting match, the kind of things that the parent takes away from the shouting match, are entirely different things from what the kid really meant to be saying. But because blood pressure was up and voices were raised, you know, you're sort of shouting against a brick wall. I wonder, therefore, if the stuff that the parent went to the newspaper with was, you know, slightly left to the field of truth, as that truth actually was. So when the kid then sees these allegations being repeated in the newspaper, it's stuff that the kid barely recognizes, except for, you know, these are the things that the parent's taken away. So the parent might have said, how long have you been doing cocaine? Since I was 17. How do you afford it? OnlyFans. So, okay, in the parent's mind, you've been doing OnlyFans since you were 17 or whatever. But it might mean that the kid's first experience with cocaine was at the age of 17, started doing OnlyFans when they were 18, became more of a cocaine habit when they were 19, whatever. What I'm saying is, you look at what the Sun have said, you look at what the kid has said, you look at what the police have said, that no criminal activity took place. In other words,
forces, not
yes,
just one. So.
Oh, the Met and the South Wales Police Force,
Yep.
right, have both said no criminal activity took place, which basically means that this kid wasn't doing OnlyFans or whatever, wasn't sending photographs until after they'd turned 18, presumably. Otherwise, there would have been some kind of criminal activity to look into. So all I'm saying is, I think the impression I took is that the parents have got one idea from one end of a conversation that is probably not what the kid was actually saying. Does that sound reasonable? Does it sound like I'm being a bit obtuse?
It does, and I think the real issue is that the Sun has run this huge story, and it's obviously, you know, had this massive effect on Hugh Edwards. It will probably kill his career.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
We'll
yeah,
come
for
to that.
sure. Yeah,
but they've done that on, I think, on one source. They haven't stood that up on anything more than that, and
no,
that is
entirely
that is
hearsay,
appalling practice.
yeah.
Yeah, normally, even, you know, if they run these things, they've got one or two things to back it up. But it's basically a one-line story that they've tried to spin out for what, 3-4 days just to damage the BBC here.
Well, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think it's so I don't think journalistic ethics is something that comes into it necessarily. I think they're basically gambling on whether the amount they have to pay out in potential libel is worth the story. But what I think they've done then is misjudged the public's capacity for sympathy on the side of Hugh Edwards, rather than for whatever reason, the public don't seem to have much sympathy for the Sun and seem to have more sympathy for Hugh Edwards. And I think the Sun didn't anticipate that as it's happened.
Sure, I think what you've got is, I think the Sun were hoping that this would go beyond its reader base, but actually what it's done is it's become the reader base against the rest of the world, hasn't it, essentially? So it's kind of in some ways become self-defeating. I mean, it's hard to say. It seems like it's become self-defeating. I guess we won't know, maybe for a couple of years, quite how this will really turn out.
Well, also because the traditional reader base of the Sun above a certain age have been looking at basically nude photos of women around that age for 20-30 years, so they probably hopefully sympathize more with Hugh Edwards and see the bits of themselves in Hugh Edwards.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. You know, they've had, I know it wasn't the Sun, I think it might be the Star, and they were, was it Charlotte Church Countdown to 16? Yeah. They've done that on page 3, girls. She's legal in how many days?
Yeah.
I
mean, the Sun did it with Samantha Fox, didn't they?
Totally, yeah. She was the youngest topless model in the country, and
sold on it.
So yeah, so for all those, we can say give the proprietor and editor of the time, say 10 year sentences for each offence, maybe.
Oh yeah, here's a little nugget of information for you. Page 3 went to, after it made its last appearance in the newspaper, which I think was about 2015. It went online and spent 2 years. They did 2 years worth of Page 3's online afterwards, I guess, for online advertising. So actually the last Page 3 girl was in 2017. But on that website, after they changed the law, they had to remove all the photographs that were taken before these models turned 18. So actually they had to remove a bunch of photographs from the website of girls who were 16 and 17 topless, which just kind of, but I mean, let's be honest, when it comes to that kind of media, talking about hypocrisy is a bit like farting into the wind, isn't it, really? You're not going to get anywhere with that talk.
And I mean, none of us can live up to their high moral standards, let's face it.
Do we think, okay, we'll come back to more about the allegations and Hugh Edwards, because obviously we have to talk about Hugh Edwards. Do we think this will end up in a libel case? Do we think, I mean, at one point, a lot of people were saying this will be the end for the Sun, give it 2 months and they'll collapse because they'll have to, just like News of the World did a few years ago after they had a not entirely dissimilar case that sort of public opinion turned around on them. I'm not sure. I get the feeling that's happening here, but I don't know. I don't have my finger on the pulse. What do either of you two think?
I don't think an individual case brings down a newspaper. I think
but in the Sun's case,
it could end up with money being paid to Hugh Edwards. I think because it's gone that far, because they suggested that criminal activity might have taken place or could have taken place. I think that sort of crossed the line, and they didn't announce who it was. But I don't know, it's complicated because the BBC made it easier to identify who it was by suspending Hugh Edwards.
Yeah.
So basically you had a week of Twitter looking for any BBC members of staff that weren't on screen that week, and all these poor BBC presenters who have been on holiday having to go, no, I'm back at work next week. I'm back at work. It wasn't me. They've got a case. There's going to be a Twitter bonanza of libel and various other things. From
Jeremy Vine wasn't saying he should out himself with it.
Jeremy
Vine. Awful. Apparently, though, the way the law works is once the Sun have made allegations, even if they don't name them, and even if there isn't a direct link, if a link is made without somebody else naming the name, then that link can be taken back to the paper that made the allegations in the first place. So I don't know, by the sound of it, from what I can gather, having listened to various lawyers talking about this over the course of the week, it sounds like the libel case is pretty much cut and dried, because, as you say, there was that mention of the number 17 in the first. So they didn't point out in that first story that it would be illegal for a 17-year-old to have nude photographs that they were selling for money, but they pointed out that they were selling photographs for money at the age of 17, which by the sound of it wasn't even true. So by presenting something that was illegal, even if you don't actually state it was illegal, essentially that could be the libel. So yeah, and it's one of those things where apparently it's more likely that the Sun would settle out of course on the balance of probability, because otherwise it would be a very expensive, high-profile court case that could cripple the newspaper.
Yeah, and it'll be Hugh Edwards. It wouldn't be the BBC because they don't do anything like that. So
no, it would be Hugh Edwards, for sure.
So it'd have to be a personal decision.
It depends whether his career is in tatters. I've got to admit,
and it depends if he's mentally fit to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess it's something that his family could do on his behalf, depending on how things go.
His very large legal team, which he can afford, will be doing it on his behalf right now, I'm guessing.
Although, having said that, I mean, he doesn't get paid anything like as much as some other people, because a lot of other people take advertising and sponsorship as well on top of their pay. And as far as I'm aware, Hugh Edwards doesn't do the kind of job where he'd be doing a lot of that kind of thing. So I'm not sure. I mean, clearly he gets paid a shed load of money, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, He pays a lot of that in taxes, and also this is one of those things. You tend to live to your means, right?
Yeah.
So presumably he's not going to be getting the whole of that money the whole of the time for the next few. What I'm saying is he might not have as much spare cash as we probably just look at him and think he's got so much spare cash he can throw it around doing whatever. Might not be quite the case. So it might not be quite as simple as I think it is.
Maybe it might be a case of a legal team coming to him and doing it on his behalf because it's lucrative.
If some like Jolyon Moore, the Good Law projects tend to go for it or something. If they want that case, if they want to go for the Sun, because there will be a lot of people who want to go for the Sun.
If the Sun have effectively driven out, deprived him of a $500,000 a year career, the sum that we could be talking about in damages could be mid 7 figures, something like that potentially. Who knows, even more for the potential mental damage as well that they've done. Let's talk about Hugh Edwards then. Silly boy, and in a not very pleasant way, I think. So I'm not looking at him as a whiter than white person in this story by any stretch of the imagination. It sounds like, well, I mean, I don't think there's any excuse really for a family man, even if he's suffering from depression, to be getting involved in paying OnlyFans or whatever it was, or some dating app or whatever, something online that brought them together, wasn't it? I suspect OnlyFans, because half of the point of OnlyFans is the people on there have to be easy to reach, because you have to promote it through social media and stuff, don't you? I've never been on the website, but that's kind of the impression I get. Do you want to know the really weird irony? Is like I was
is that JR has an OnlyFans profile. He just very rarely goes on it. Just
you see the unboxing video. Yeah. That one is your advertising.
I was on like social media looking up the Hugh Edwards stuff and this was the day after they'd named him, so this would have been Thursday, I think. And I'm on social media looking at the stuff, and you know how you'll get 3 posts and then an advert and another 4 posts and an advert. I got 3 posts, and the 4th one was some girl wearing a skimpy top saying, "Oh, come and wank yourself silly over me, here's my OnlyFans account." And I'm thinking, of all the adverts that you could have had in the middle of this news story, that is just insane, isn't it?
No, a friend whose partner died recently, I was looking at their post, and as that 3rd post was an OnlyFans post. I think he's taking grim humour out of it, because it was quite regular after that on anything he posted. It's like, oh dear God.
I don't usually notice that stuff, but that it turned up in the middle of this story was just that, and because it's OnlyFans, and because I don't know whether it's been said outright, but there was a lot of suggestion that OnlyFans was where this started. I don't know whether maybe that's been debunked or something.
I think it's an assumption, isn't it, more than anything else? It's the obvious assumption to make.
Yeah, you pay money for things like images, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Well, then that goes back to that original conversation. The thing that the parents took from the conversation is that the kid was taking photographs of themselves and sending them to the BBC presenter. But if it goes back to OnlyFans, then the truth is the kid's getting photographs taken, putting them up online, and the BBC presenter is just one of the people who's accessing those photographs and paying for them.
Aren't the parents estranged as well from the child?
Sounds like it. Certainly now, yeah.
Yeah. It's so.
Yes.
Yeah, it's quite murky.
But it sounds like it went further than it should have.
Yeah.
So that photograph surfaced of him showing his bum, apparently, which looked like, I don't know whether it's been debunked or not, but it looked like a fake to me. It didn't look like Hugh Edwards to me at all. It looked like his head had been stuck on somebody else's body.
I have no idea what his bum looks like, to be honest. So, what your criteria are.
No. I mean, it was a very thin figure with his bum out, and then Hugh Edwards' face on top of the very thin, tall body. And I'm thinking, well, tall and thin, that's not really what I think of when I think of Hugh Edwards, right?
No, you think of theatre, obviously.
But you know what I mean? It looked like a Photoshop picture, but the picture was there too. And besides, you've got to ask, how would people have got hold of that picture anyway, even if it was real? But the picture is basically there to represent something else, which is the fact that however this started, it crossed a line at some point, didn't it? And I think the second complaint the BBC received, when somebody said that he'd sworn at them in an email or something, and they took that in a menacing way. But what I gathered from that is that that person had apparently got in touch with him and threatened to reveal his name. And presumably he'd just reacted badly to that and sworn back at them and said, don't you fucking dare, or whatever. And so I don't know, again, whether what we hear, because when the BBC put it out, again, as part of this overcorrection, they're making out like the person who's making the complaint has to be taken at face value, but they don't give us the actual quotes. So we don't know what that face value is. So it's hard to relate that back to Hugh Edwards, as we later subsequently found out that it was Hugh Edwards. Well, no, we found out the two things at the same time, didn't we? But it's hard to relate that back to what his mindset would have been and how threatening this message actually could have been if the threat had come from the other side in the first place. And I'm not entirely sure whether it was proven that this threatening email was returned after this person had threatened to out him. As it transpired, irrelevantly anyway, because his family was just about to do the same thing. But again, you get these things and it seems like it's such a black and white issue. Oh, Hugh Edwards has gone around threatening somebody, but actually the truth might be more or less the opposite of that. It's not black and white. It's a real grey area, and without the actual quotes in front of us, we don't know which way to read it, right?
So I think so if you're a postman and you do these things, then HR would look into it, discover you've done nothing illegal, nothing to send on to the police. They'll discover that you've been a stupid person. You'll apologise and you'll probably go back to being a postman, because being a postman, you don't have to be necessarily squeaky clean. If you're putting letters through person's doors, they won't necessarily know. I think Hugh Edwards is, to be a newsreader on the News at 10, you can't be a newsreader in the future and report on sort of similar stories even if the stories are false entirely. The fact that the stories are there and the innuendos there, it kind of distracts from your job. So I think his job as a newsreader is over for a while, unless he can, I don't know, get a job on Songs of Praise and rehabilitate himself, or do a Richard. So Richard Bacon had to quit Blue Peter, probably, rightly, because he became a story in the tabloid press, but that wasn't his career over. He ended up making a lot more money, I think, by doing other things, by moving into adult adult radio broadcasting and TV production. So I think, Hugh Edwards could still be employed by the BBC, but just in a different mode.
Maybe a Sunday morning's politics programme, because then you're in charge of which stories you tell, right? Or you have a production team in charge of which stories you tell.
You'd have to wait until the Conservatives are out of power. Otherwise, every story you'd be telling is a sex scandal. So that's the worst. That's like sending the lion into the lion's den, effectively.
Oh, Lee Anderson with his BBC's A Den of Perverts, he says, despite the fact that 15 of his colleagues are currently suspended on sexual charges or whatever.
And they appointed a known, someone with accusations hanging over them to be Deputy Chief Whip. So
unbelievable.
Come on.
And they appointed a known adulterer to be Prime Minister.
Well, yeah.
Serial.
But it can't even count as children. Yeah. What do we think of Hugh Edwards then? Because like I said earlier, he is without question culpable for some of this, and I don't think suffering from depression is an excuse for the things that he's culpable for. Having said that, I think generally speaking, he's always been regarded with a lot of respect, especially by the people who are closer to him. And I think you're right. A lot of the sympathy eventually, once people had kind of made up their minds, a lot of the sympathy came out for him. And I think his reputation's probably not been tarnished as much as it might have been.
So I think he's, my opinion of Hugh Edwards is fine so long as he hasn't bullied someone in the workplace. Well, I mean, I'm not happy if he's bullied anybody anywhere. But if he's not been inappropriate in the workplace, he hasn't used his power in the workplace as a way of getting people. So that power imbalance. I mean, if he does something in his private life, I mean, the problem is he's a well-known figure, so there's always going to be that power imbalance, whether he thinks there is or not.
Absolutely, yeah.
Regarding his marriage, I mean, it could be that he has the sort of marriage where he's free to, like, you know, do what he wants, and vice versa.
But marriages can withstand this kind of thing, I suppose, especially amongst people of a certain age, because I suppose once your sort of younger years are past, you have other priorities. So, I mean, it obviously depends on the people in question, but I suppose they could be at a stage where, I mean, if he's suffering from depression and he is in the habit of doing inappropriate things, for want of a better word, buying photographs of teenagers or whatever, it could be that his wife presumably wouldn't like that, but might understand that there are reasons, there are places why it happens and where it comes from. And so it could be, because clearly at the moment he's in a facility somewhere being looked after, right? And he's not going to be coming out of that facility in the next fortnight or something like that, is he? He's going to, this is the kind of thing, this is front page news for like 5-6 days in a row, and you're the subject of that news, and not in a good way, for 5-6 days in a row, and you already suffer from anxiety, depression, all those things. This is going to put him away for months, I would have thought, weeks at the very least. He's going to come out of this a changed man, I would have thought. I mean, he might go back to bad habits if he's not kept a close eye on, if people don't keep a close eye on what he's up to. But this is not just a wake-up call. This is a wake-up, kick up the ass, isn't it?
I don't think he's going to go back to the point where, he was the man who announced the Queen's death on the BBC.
No, absolutely. No,
that has definitely affected his career, and that might affect his earning potential in the future, certainly.
Oh, yeah.
If the BBC are going, well, you can't do that anymore, they're not going to pay that wage. I mean, he's just being very, very stupid at best.
Yeah,
but again, you can go through it. 2 police forces have looked at and said there's nothing illegal happened. I wouldn't do it what he's done, but it's a matter for him and his wife to sort out, rather than something really to be dirty laundry to be aired in public.
I'd imagine he'll be all right as well. I'd imagine pretty soon, before or after he's let out of hospital, he'll start writing his memoirs.
Or there's the newspaper interview, isn't it?
Someone newspaper interview, the sit down, whatever our version of a sit down with Oprah is, where he can sort of talk about mental health and the challenges of this.
God, the Piers Morgan shit stuff.
Yeah. Which is fine. I mean, so so long as if he wants to turn this into something, a campaign for good, then I think that's a worthy thing.
Absolutely.
That would be rehabilitatory, wouldn't it?
Yeah. As a curious side effect, campaigning for mental health would also go some way to rehabilitate him.
Going back to what you were saying before, though, I meant to pick up on it as you were talking about it. There have, of course, been a couple of complaints, from internal ones, from members of the BBC, from people who said they had inappropriate messages from him. But again, those seem to be, I don't know whether they were, but you got the impression they were relatively isolated incidents, and they weren't ones where he overstepped a mark and then continued to overstep the mark. I got the impression that whatever was said, he then backed off. I could be wrong, but that was the impression you got from the way the story was told. Mm-hmm. But again, with so much of this stuff, they don't tell us, obviously they're not going to tell us who, but they don't tell us what was said, and they don't tell us what the result of what was said was. So with so much of this stuff, which we've just been left to kind of draw our own conclusions, really, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing the content, we can't actually say what did overstep any marks? What was it appropriately investigated? It's
what
just
we can say, just before you go on, what we can say is that these people would have been offered access to the police if they'd have wanted to
totally
move their complaint up, and none of them have. None of them seem to have moved their complaint up into the HR department at the BBC or whatever. So
and you can escalate it from there to an official complaint, obviously.
So none of these things have escalated beyond being reported. And to be honest, and I don't want to diminish the people who made the complaints, but they seem like they were relatively innocuous enough that I'm not sure they should have been reported on the BBC as they stood.
I mean, it might be. So often with these cases, it's a sort of floodgates get opened. So you might find, there are people external to the BBC that supply information to the HR department, which they probably, if it's not illegal, they'll probably not pay that much attention to. But the internal stuff, they'll be gathering evidence, and that would be, then we'd see him sacked, presumably, or moved.
Well,
on.
yes.
Is it the BBC just putting stuff out there just in case it comes out beforehand, though? If they're not actually specifying anything or identifying individuals, it's just them trying to get ahead of the story.
Possibly, but I think there's a separation between the news reporting and the HR report. So the HR thing, they're not going to say anything ever.
No, they can't. That's illegal.
And we'll only hear that he's been sacked, I'd imagine. He'll have the report in private, they'll have report in private, and that'll be it. So we won't know anything. But if he's been sacked, then it means that, they found that he's done something within the organisation that was inappropriate.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously it could still turn out that way. The odd thing about this, though, is it seems to have run aground before even his name was revealed, because the Sun never added to their story, never substantiated what they had. And it's the kind of thing where you would expect the Sun putting the story out on a Friday, they would have had other people come to them over the weekend so that by the Monday they would be the ones revealing further accusations or whatever. It just seems...
Wasn't there a sort of a conflict between them and the Sunday Times? Because they effectively share the same sources. So there was something about competition between the two papers over who would share what and when things would be reported.
Well, it was the Sunday Times who said he'd been involved in illegal activity, and so they're the ones who, I think, made the thing about the 17-year-old an actual accusation rather than an insinuation. And so I think a lot of the trouble between the Sun and the Sunday Times is about the fact that the Sunday Times might have landed the Sun in the middle of a big libel case. But then again, I mean, it might turn out not to be a libel case if indeed, as you say, this does escalate, he does get sacked. Then it might be that the people who would have taken on the libel case on his behalf might get cold feet over it, because, if there's further stuff to come out, it might not be so easy to convince that the Sun did in fact libel him in the first place. So I don't know, there are any number of ways this story could go from this point.
Again, the other thing, and I'm not saying this is the right thing, is that it tends to be a kind of, I don't want to say mafia, but there's a rule that you don't go after other journalists, and the Sun here have gone after another journalist. So that might be part of the distasteful nature of it in terms of the rest of the media as well.
But having said that, the Sun have gone after a BBC journalist, and that's what this all comes back to, isn't it? Rupert Murdoch versus the BBC, and the editor of the Sun has had something fall in their lap that was so much like gold dust that they've used it, apparently it seems, without even working out whether it's actual gold dust or pixie dust. And it turns out maybe it was pixie dust after all.
Which kind of goes back, goes back to the Sun drawing its editors from the from the showbiz column. That bizarre. So that isn't helpful, because you can't run a news organization like you'd run just a gossip column, or you shouldn't do.
But that is what this has all been about, really. It's not about Boris Johnson and his phone. It's about Rupert Murdoch wanting to get rid of the BBC. And we're in this sort of dying days, hopefully the dying days, of a Tory government that's swinging so far to the right that things like this do become kind of existential threats almost to an organisation like the BBC. It feels like if Labour get in at the next election, some kind of normality might be restored. But it feels to me like if by some miracle the Tory party did get themselves re-elected, that things like this, and presumably the Sun and other newspapers too perhaps, would probably try and drill more nails into the coffin. But it feels to me the way the Tory party are going, if they get re-elected, that's going to give them a license to swing even more to the right, and organisations like the BBC and the NHS might be in trouble.
I mean, one good thing is the Tory MPs are all quitting. So Ben Wallace has just quit. This evening. He's not going to stand in the next election. And
he's the new Nadine Dorries, isn't he?
Yeah, this is becoming
I didn't get the job I wanted.
Yeah, this is becoming a repeated thing, that it'll end up just being Jacob Rees-Mogg in his safe constituency, and that will be it.
Oh, it's not that safe.
Well,
Mark Francois is the one with the safe constituency, 50,000 majority or something.
No, but the ones who are still there are the Priti Patels of this world, aren't they? The sort of Suella Bravermans of this world, rather. So that's what I mean. Whoever's left, the party is going to swing so far to the right.
They've been swinging that way for years, though. If you go back,
that's what I mean.
You go back to the 2005 election. Are you thinking what we're thinking? All the insinuations, all that sly stuff. All the cabinet itself. Cameron was lipstick on a pig. He was that want to be a Tony Blair. They've just had this faction, and since Cameron killed the collective responsibility for the Brexit referendum, it's been uncontrollable.
But the point I'm making is an election victory when you're that far to the right already just gives them license to.
It'd be a disaster because they haven't got a clue how to run a country. They're running it for media headlines. It seems they don't have a clue how to do the serious work that would entrench reforms. Whatever you think of Margaret Thatcher, she could do that.
You get rid of the NHS, you get rid of the license fee. And these things are gone for good because you can't. It's like Brexit. People complain that Keir Starmer won't say he wants us to get us back into the European Union. But the fact is, if he was to do another referendum on the European Union and you put in front of the people of this country, we'd have to go back on less favourable terms than we were on before, and we'd lose the pound and we'd be part of the Eurozone. You're not going to get the vote to go back into the European Union. And he knows that. So we've got to make the best of being outside of it. Same thing with the NHS. You get rid of the NHS, or to all intents and purposes, get rid of the NHS. It's almost impossible to bring back. Nobody ever promises to bring back free dental care, do they? Because once that was gone, it was gone, and it stays gone.
And look at the state of that now. Hang on, wasn't there something about NHS dental care this week in the news as well? I didn't see a great deal of it because I've been on holiday.
Well, they're going to try and make sure people have. So there's a report that said that people should have access to free dental care.
Or NHS dental care, which is not free. But I guess it's about £50 a procedure. Yeah, or more than £50 a procedure. It was £50 last time I looked. But point being, it's not free. I mean, some people should and probably do presumably get a certain amount of free dental care. My point is, though, do you remember when we were kids? You just went to the dentist. It was free. It was free for you. It was free for your parents. It was free for everybody. It was on the NHS. That's how it worked. Once it's gone, it's gone. License fee, though, is what I'm coming back to. If the Tory party got rid of the license fee, no future politician in their right mind would promise to bring it back, right?
And it's difficult in an age where you're talking about the stream. Well, we don't know where streaming is going yet, but in the current TV landscape, you probably can't justify it. With the NHS, it should point out it's not free. It's free at the point of use. So our taxes pay for that to be there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. None of these things are free,
there's
but
slight
the point
distinction.
being, yeah.
It's there when you need it, which is the general idea.
Just
Yeah,
like dental care was and should still be.
It's all Tory party run on ideology at the minute. There isn't any idea how to improve the country or improve the state of anything. I think I saw, public sector pay rises. Someone doing a thread on how generally, with the sort of the multiplier effect of the way that the wages filter into the system, they pay for themselves, but the government won't do it, and they will cut the services to give that frontline service. Oh, and what was the link to? Oh, we're going to pay for the public sector pay rises through increased visa costs for immigrants.
Oh yeah, that was part of it.
Well,
that wasn't
politically awful.
Most of it was.
Cynical.
Oh, and Rishi Sunak sounded like a child when he was. Did you hear the statement he made, as opposed to read it?
I didn't, but frankly, I wouldn't be surprised because he hasn't got any sort of presence.
It was all. Oh no, it was worse than that. It was awful. He basically said, "We're recommending that you take. We're accepting the recommendations that are being given to us, and we're recommending that you implement these recommendations. But you're going to have to pay for it yourself because we didn't want to give you this much money, and you shouldn't be having this much money. And if you want to have this much money, then you're going to have to pay for it yourselves." That was basically what he said, and it was like that. It was absolutely appalling. It was like a child. I've never seen anything like it.
Again, it's illiterate because you go to the bottom or the entry level jobs in public sector organisations. They pay the same as if you go down to your local supermarket and get a shelf stacking job, and it can be far less stressful because you can be on the phones all day dealing with complaints, and that is not a mental thing anyone really wants to handle all day.
No, for sure.
So how do you get people in if they just haven't got any clue about how people live on that? I don't think at this end.
Right. On that note, unless anybody's got anything they want to add, we've overrun our 20 minutes by a distance of about 114% or something. And John, we were supposed to be finishing this early so you could get on, and we haven't finished this as early as we wanted to. So I think I'm going to knock it on the head, unless there is something more that either of you two wants to bring up.
Not yet.
No.
Okay, we may be back. We may be back. Until we are, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.